The Colorado Avalanche look to get grittier as they want to go back on a long playoff run. It's the Ottawa Senators hoping to finally reach the playoffs and end their long drought. And can the Calgary Flames retool, get this team back on track? We've got all that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. And we are now available on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just do a search for Locked On NHL. It is great to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Avalanche, Shaggy Von Doom himself, Kyle Sullivan. And Kyle, disappointing playoff for the Avalanche. Injuries really hurting this team. We know Landeskog is not going to be back this year, and the Avs have been busy this offseason. What do you think so far has been the best move this team has made since the season ended?
I honestly, if you're going back and looking at the Avalanche team that won the Cup just 1 year removed, and you're looking at the moves that they have made this offseason, you can chalk every fiber of the moves that they made up to a win, because it is a commitment to a team grittiness that they did not have last year. And it showed with the injuries, like you brought up. This team, yes, they can outscore you. Yes, they can out-finesse you. They are fast, but they are fragile. And without Gabe Landeskog this year, you're without a captain. But every move they made, from Ryan Johansson to Miles Wood, Jonathan Drouin, and Ross Colton, like that alone, that sounds like almost like an all-star roster. Like you draft it in NHL 23, 24, and that's your fantasy roster. That's something it just makes Avalanche fans salivate for next year. But every justification from Chris MacFarland and Joe Sakic behind these moves is we need to get grittier, because that's a first-round bounce to the Seattle Kraken. Yes, it's embarrassing, but you see Vegas hoisting the cup, and that's a definition of a gritty team that won the cup. It was not so much the best team in the league. It was the team that was built to last. And you could see with Florida falling apart, they were not built to last. Vegas was, and Colorado is trying to replicate that.
That makes sense. And, certainly the physicality was lacking a little bit last season and into the playoffs. It looks like they're trying to address that. Are you a little bit concerned about what they gave up for the long term?
Honestly, not really. When you look at these moves, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek now in Avalanche circles. It's a typical Sakic move. Like, don't pick up the phone if it says Joe Sakic on the caller ID, because he's going to swindle you in one way or another. I think the biggest thing they let go would be Alex Newhook, and that's still a gamble. Montreal, in my opinion, just overpaid for Alex Newhook to be a member of the Montreal Canadiens for the next 4 years, and that contract is a borderline egregious for a wish and a prayer. He had the keys to the city last year in the 2C position that Jared Bednar himself said this is his to lose, and he ended the season on the fourth line. He started out the Stanley Cup season in the minors because he wasn't ready yet mentally for that role of a superstar on this team. The tools are there. He just can't put it together. And Montreal is taking a gamble at this. And for that to be a piece that you let up, and you had Nashville retain half of Ryan Johansson's salary to bring him in. Miles Wood, yes, it's one of the more expensive moves they made, but it's still not breaking the bank. And you're still taking a wish and a prayer on Johansson and Miles Wood because of their injury history. But you have Ross Colton and the project of Jonathan Drouin. There's a lot of things you can be excited about.
You talked about losing Landeskog and the leadership that goes along with that. Who do you think on this roster picks up the slack and becomes the new leader, at least for this season, on this team?
I think, honestly, this team It's understood this is a Nathan MacKinnon team, but this team has a very next man up mentality. Nathan MacKinnon might be the quote unquote leader, but this team answers to everybody. It's an accountability thing. It's not one guy directing. This is a Jared Bednar. He issues the order, he issues the lines, and they work as a unit. And you saw that the entire run of the Stanley Cup with Darren Helm as a playoff hero. It's not what you write out, but he was that guy. And you're going to expect that a lot, especially with these players that they brought in. They're sexy picks when it comes to production, but they fit exactly what the Avalanche want. And that's what they do. They run the Avalanche system. It's not so much a captain-led team, it's a unit.
Do you expect any more moves this offseason, or do you think this team is more or less set the way it's going to be?
See, and that's where you can catch me and Chris on Locked On Avalanche talking about this, because this is the great conundrum. Do the Avalanche go and fill out this roster with the little remaining league men talent? Do they call from within, from the Colorado Eagles, and finally get that system going? It's kind of been dead in the water for the past year or two. They need to get that going. Or do they just say, this is good for now, and then run it again at the trade deadline? That's where this team sits right now. As is, on paper, this team's good enough to be in the top part of the Central with Nathan MacKinnon, Mikko Rantanen, and Cale Makar. But we'll see what this offseason still holds. I didn't expect Ryan Johansson to be a member of the Colorado Avalanche, but Joe Sakic, he's good at making deals.
So as of right now, do you feel this team is better than they were a year ago, and by how much?
Well, as of right now, they haven't lost a game, so that's fantastic. But I would say, yes, this team is grittier. This team is there. Yes, it's more of a gamble on what you're getting injury-wise with their history. But if everybody is 100% healthy, you would be silly not to be very excited for what this team could put up.
Landeskog's future. I mean, we know he's not going to play this coming season. Is this potentially career-ending for him?
See, this is where you got the luck of the draw. If you would have got my co-host Chris Maselli, he holds out optimism that Gabe Landeskog is coming back. But I say, to quote the wise prophet Lee Corso, not so fast, my friend. This is not an injury you just rush back from. And this is 2 years of not NHL action. That's going to be hard to come back from. And I honestly, at the end of the day, when Landy finally gets healthy and starts that comeback, does his body allow him to make that comeback? Because that is a lot to get back to NHL playing shape and to be the leader of the Colorado Avalanche. And he's a father now. He has kids. He has other things to think about. And he's got to make that decision. And it's one of those things. I think he's better suited right now in a front office role when it's all said and done than coming back and leading the Colorado Avalanche.
Well, we'll see what the future holds for Gabriel Landeskog. Kyle, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
Oh, you can search Locked On Avalanche. We're on YouTube. You can see our smiling faces each and every day. You can find us on all the socials and follow Locked On NHL as well. One of us will pop in here every now and then.
And as far as your social media accounts?
Oh, if you want to follow me personally, you can find me at Shaggy Von Doom.
All right, Kyle, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Gil. It's always a pleasure.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting on Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend on betting on everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think will hit the first home run. And no matter what Major League Baseball team you root for, you'll find great odds, props, and all kinds of other interesting bets on FanDuel. It's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. So sign up today. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. And welcome, everybody, to the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. And you can now hear us on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just do a search for Locked On NHL. It's great to bring in a familiar face to Locked On NHL viewers and a familiar voice for listeners, Ross Levitan of Locked On Senators. And it has certainly been an eventful offseason for the Ottawa Senators, Ross. Let's start off with a basic question. Are you happy with the overall moves this team has made so far?
I think to say yes, I'll need to rewind back to the trade deadline because Ottawa made that huge splash for Jacob Chikrin, but only got 12 games out of him before the injury, and then Thomas Chabot went down. So I think in terms of the entirety, if you include the new look defensive core that hasn't had a chance to all play together yet, then I am happy. But when it comes to losing DeBrincat, you can't be happy when you're giving up the best player in any trade, especially one where you're trading within the division with a 25-year-old who had a down year, by his standards. But I think everyone's expecting Alex DeBrincat to get back to an above 30, maybe even back to being a 40-goal scorer next year. So that was a tough trade. There's no question. We broke it down in kind of in bits and pieces on Locked On Senators last week, so people can go check out that immediate reaction from last Monday morning. But yeah, they addressed the goaltending. That was a big thing. They got Joonas Korpisalo in on a 5-year deal that is either going to be a home run or it's going to be a ground out. There's no in between, it feels like, where he's either going to exceed expectations based on the AAV, or maybe you're going to then look at it in a year or two and he hasn't, and you're like, wow, that's a long contract to sign. So they took a swing. I appreciate it. Korpisalo had a great season last year, both in Columbus and in LA. And in the DeBrincat trade in particular, I mean, you get back a middle six forward, which they needed, in Dominic Kubalik. You get that first-round pick. I wish it was Detroit's for sure, rather than Steve Yzerman getting to pick the lower of the two. But to answer your question, I think this team is much more balanced than it was last year. They had the great top six, even with Josh Norris injured quick early last season. But now it's a more balanced team. Are they better? We'll have to wait till October till they drop the puck.
You talked about giving up the best player in the DeBrincat trade. Do you think the Senators got enough in return?
I think they had their hands tied. I'm not trying to be an apologist for the team here. I think that the real mistake was not doing their due diligence before acquiring DeBrincat, that they think if you really break it down, because now Ottawa is a cap team, and I'm still trying to rack my brain as the host of Locked On Senators about how the cap even matters, because since we've hosted this show, the Senators have been near the floor every single year. It hasn't mattered what moves to make to get you close to the top and how to maneuver your cap. But now with Tim Stuetzle's extension kicking in next year, Brady's in the third year of his $8 million deal, and Josh Norris, they have all these guys making $8 million or more. Now it matters. I have no idea how Pierre Dorion, the Ottawa Senators management, thought they were going to add to Brinkat's, well, it ends up being 7.8985. Let's be clear. The Sens were offering more than that on a long-term contract. It sounded like 8x8 was the offer, if it even got to an offer stage, because it might have been just, hey, are you interested in staying here long-term? No, actually, I'm not. Let's work on a trade instead. So I just don't know how they got it in their minds that this was a good idea. Or if you thought, you're like, hey, this is going to be a 2-year thing, then just sign him to his qualifying offer and run it back. But in terms of the situation that they found themselves in, I think it's okay. I mean, funny enough, Kubalik and DeBrincat actually scored the same amount of even strength 5-on-5 goals last year. But again, it was a down year for Alex DeBrincat. He hit a ton of posts, just didn't really always look comfortable, and also was playing with a 21-year-old rookie in Shane Pinto because of the injury to Josh Norris that I mentioned. So, yeah, I think the return, it's a bit underwhelming. But when you put it in the perspective of, hey, if he was only going to sign an extension with Detroit, they had all the leverage in the world, and they used it. But when you look at it from the point that Ottawa only gave up draft picks to get him, you can feel a little bit better about that if you are a Sens fan.
You talked about Norris. Do you think he's ready to start the season? Is he 100% ready to go?
Yeah, sounds like we actually had Pierre Doria on our show about 2 weeks ago, and he said that he's been skating for 3-4 weeks now. So that's the make or break, because as I said, they're more balanced this way. And Norris didn't play last year. He scored 1 goal. He played, I think it was 7 or 8 games total. You could realistically hope that Norris's goal production replaces what Alex DeBrincat put up last year. And that's where then everyone else kind of falls in place beyond that. And then their center depth can actually be what the Senators thought it was going to be, which is young, with Stuetzle, Norris, Pinto, and Mark Kastelik, all under 24 years old, 3 of them under 23. And it just feels like, it does kind of feel, though, that they're one injury away up front, because the depth up front isn't where it should be, I don't think, based on all of the high draft picks they've had. But they might have to just, take a step back and say, we got to let a couple of the kids play, like the Angus Crookshanks, the Igor Sokolovs, the Roby Yarventis. They've had all these high draft picks, but other than Ridley Gregg last year, none of them have really grabbed the bull by the horns and been like, hey, I'm going to produce at the NHL level day in and day out. So, Gil, that's where I think the Senators really need one more addition, which I'm sure we're going to get into. It's the depth up front. I'm not sure if that's up to par to be a playoff team, but their top 6 to me is plenty good enough. When you have I'll put Brady Tkachuk, Tim Stuetzle, and Claude Giroux as a top line up with the best in the league. Like, I really do believe that Tim Stuetzle is only scratching the surface. 90 points last year. Brady Tkachuk, I want to say I saw a stat the other day. Players with 80 points, 100 penalty minutes, and 100 hits in one season in the last 40 years, there's 2 guys to do it. Brady and Matthew Tkachuk. So they're just, unicorns as they are. And Claude Giroux, a future Hall of Famer in my mind, had a 79-point season. But it's what are they going to do behind that offensively to give those guys the support that they need to be a successful team?
So, I mean, there are still some rumors out there of some possible additional moves this offseason. What are you hearing, and what do you think is likely, if anything?
Well, I know they were talking with Vladimir Tarasenko's agent, new and old. We know Tarasenko replaced his agent about last week. And funny enough, Pat Brisson is also kind of in the news in Ottawa as well. That's who Tarasenko has decided to have represent him, because Jake Sanderson, Ottawa's young stud defenseman, just moved into his agency this summer. And people are wondering if, like Tim Stuetzle last year, if they could lock up one of their core pieces to maybe a team-friendly contract sooner rather than later. So I know Tarasenko's name has been thrown out there. I just don't understand. The Sens have $5 million in cap space right now, and they still have to sign Shane Pinto. So let's say if we're looking at the Noah Cates contract that was just signed as kind of an area that we could see Shane Pinto in, $2.5 to $2.8 million AAV. That's not leaving you that much. You've got about $3 million to play with. So I was looking, and we've been kind of talking more the trade route, where Ottawa would send a bit of money back and try to get, whether it's a Scott Lawton from Philadelphia or a Connor Garland from the Vancouver Canucks, these gritty middle 6 wingers. I think that's the type of player that Ottawa would like to complement some of the shooters that they have right now, and Kubalik adding another one. And then if you are going to stay the free agent route, Thomas Tatar is a name that's really interesting to me. Plus 41 last year, just a defensively responsible guy. He's not going to have to drive a line with Ottawa. He'll just have to be, a competent third line type winger. So I've been kind of pushing for Thomas Tatar as an option for the Senators. And then Pia Suter would be another one, where these aren't your sexy names. Like, Ottawa's got their core all locked in. The top 4 on defense looks great now with Chikrin Shabbat, Sanderson, Zub, and they've got a couple guys pushing. Tyler Cleven's a name I think fans are going to start to know more and more as this year goes along. But if they could get that third line supporting forward, preferably a winger, preferably a guy who's going to take a 1-year deal at under $3 million, I think the Sens should be all over it. If for no other reason, then you just can't have enough depth. Injuries are going to happen throughout the year, and you need these guys like a Thomas Tatar can be on a top line. He's going to be the third player on it, but he has the IQ to play with these smart players. So I just think they're going to need some depth, but can they find it on the waiver wire? Can they find it once the season starts? I think if you're Pierre Doria, we've kind of been of the mind there's no excuses this year. Like, it's been 6 straight years out of the playoffs. The young core, the talent is there, but now it's like, okay, there's just no excuse. So I would do everything I can to have the depth that I don't need excuses, that I can just plug in guys when other injuries are bound to happen.
Well, we'll see what happens. Should be an interesting couple of months before training camp gets started. Ross, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Well, especially from that last answer, we just posted a clip, which we'll do sometimes from our episodes on YouTube, Locked On Senators. You can find the podcast 5 days a week. Well, now 3, actually. Now that we're in the deep summer, we're going to do Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes. One of my favorite parts of the show, too, is every Wednesday we'll have a different Senators fan on the show just to talk about how they became a Sens fan, their favorite memories, really tap into the nostalgia. So we're excited to have our Sens Central citizens back, and we're in the middle of interview season, so plenty of interviews and all that sort of thing you can find on YouTube and wherever you get your Locked On podcasts.
All right, Ross, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Gil. Looking forward to our next chat.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. And you can also now hear us on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just do a search for Locked On NHL. It is great to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Flames, Jess Belmosto. And Jess, it's been a little too long since we've had you back here on the show. A lot of people not happy with the Flames this offseason. Is it as bad as some of the critics are saying, or is this just sort of a phase?
I want to say this is like the initial growing pains of this competitive retool Craig Conroy has going on. Elias Lindholm hasn't made his decision on if he's looking to sign an extension or, willing to be moved this season. And Noah Hanifin, who has made it clear that he wants to be traded and go back to the U.S., is still on the roster. So I don't know. I fully expected at least Hanifin to be on the move before the draft or during the draft, but Tyler Toffoli was the only one that went before the draft. So
what are the rumors now, if any, that you're hearing as far as potential destinations, potential, compensation?
There's nothing, honestly. And it's been so hard. I think that a lot of people are just either keeping tight-lipped or just pulling things out of left field that are not going to happen. As much as Elias Lindholm has helped this team, he is not a 1C on a truly competitive team. And, if teams are looking for a second line center, then they should be interested in him. And he brings a lot to the team. Production was down last year, but it was for everyone. And he does have a great two-way game. So I would be interested in trading for him.
And what do you think he might get? What do you think the Flames could get back in exchange for him?
I am so bad at trade packages because I either severely overvalue or undervalue a player. But just because of the way the salary cap is right now, I would say that the Flames would have to take a player back and probably a draft pick, maybe a second rounder, just because maybe a first rounder if they're feeling generous. But I think it does truly depend on who this trade partner is. Is he going to go back to Carolina? They might be willing to kind of sweeten the deal a little bit. Or is it going to be a team like Boston that really needs a second line center and depth down the middle, and they can trade Jake DeBrusk or Matt Grzelcyk and just kind of bring something to the Flames lineup and not just the hope of being a good team.
So as of right now, what do you see the outlook being for this team? I mean, give me some reasons for hope. Let's start with that.
Dustin Wolf. I think really, I hate putting so much pressure on, young prospects, especially ones that haven't made that official leap to the NHL. But Dustin Wolf truly does seem like he is the future of the Calgary Flames goaltending. And he's going to be learning from Jacob Markstrom, who, I think is a great mentor and someone who is so competitive and holds himself to a high standard that you would want to kind of see, what does he do differently at this level that maybe I'm not implementing in my outside of the rink routine. I think that, he's done everything he's need to do in the AHL, back-to-back goaltender of the year awards, things like that. And Matthew Coronado should be making the roster too. I haven't seen if he's going back to Harvard, but it kind of just sounds like he's just going to join either the Wranglers or the Flames. And then, of course, Jacob Pelletier. He is truly someone that the Flames just needed to inject into their lineup full speed last year. He's fast. He can score. He can set up plays. They didn't have a true finisher last year, and they needed him. But because of poor performance, not my words, he was benched and he was scratched. And there was no reason for it other than he was a young player, because the older guys on the fourth line were making the same mistakes.
And was that a pattern within the Flames organization that because I know covering the Islanders, they tended to give young players almost no margin for error, and veterans got a lot of margin for error. Is that similar as to what was happening in Calgary?
Absolutely. I went to a game out in LA. They lost 8-2, and Pelletier had a turnover, and they're already down 5-2 in like the second period, and he was benched for the rest of the game. And I was just like, why wouldn't you want him out there to get some reps in? Sure, you're losing, but just put him out on the ice. He's going faster and can do more than, a weighted down fourth line. So
what do you think the plan is as far, are we looking at, you talked about a retool versus a rebuild. Are we looking at a 2 to 3 year plan, a 1 to 2 year plan, or is this going to be a long-term kind of a situation?
So we've talked about this on Locked On Flames, my co-hosts Nick and I, and it kind of feels like it's going to have to be a 2 to 3 year plan just because of the pending UFAs next season, and then Jacob Markstrom's contract ending in 3 years, and just truly giving Ryan Huska and Craig Conroy time to kind of settle in and get a feel for things and see where the team is at. I feel like it should just be a full-blown rebuild, but you're never going to sell that to a general manager and an owner, more so the ownership than anything. And it's just the soggy middle. There's no winning, but there's plenty of losing.
Do you think the fan base would be on board with a full rebuild?
The smart ones would be. I think that, the Flames have never done a true rebuild. It's just kind of been moving pieces here and there. And there were talks of doing a full blown rebuild and blowing things up back in 2020 when I started covering the team. And none of those key pieces are there anymore. So you have to really look at things from this new perspective. And I think that Craig Conroy is a smart man and will make good decisions. But again, he's just dipping his toes in the water. It's been 3 months, but we got to get this ball rolling because guys are going to start coming back to Calgary before we know it.
Yeah, it's season is closer than we think, and that's a good thing, I think. But,
I agree.
Jess, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yes, so you can find Locked On Flames wherever you get your podcasts, and of course on YouTube as well, and over on Twitter at @LO_FlamesPod. And then of course you can follow me on Twitter at Jess Belmosto, and I'm always up for a good conversation, debate, whatever, anything.
I love it. All right, Jess, thank you so much for joining us today.
Have a great day. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank my guest, Kyle Sullivan from Locked On Avalanche, Ross Levitan from Locked On Senators, and Jess Belmosto from Locked On Flames. Thank each of them for joining us today. Thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Everydayers, tomorrow on the show, we will have the biggest stories from around the National Hockey League. I'm Gil Martin. I'm here every Monday for the Locked On NHL podcast, and I co-host the Friday edition with Rachel Donner. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for watching and listening to the Locked On NHL podcast.